Hello everybody, my name is Eleni Boyd and I'm currently enrolled as an external student in this unit. I hope everybody is enjoying the on-campus classes up in Sydney, and unfortunately I'm unable to be there in person as I'm based in Melbourne and currently working full-time, but hopefully things are going well. Today I'll be presenting my video presentation on the US invasion of Afghanistan, which commenced all the way back in 2001. This topic was addressed under Module 8 of the course guide, specifically to change a regime. As part of my presentation today, I'll be specifically addressing why did the US want to change the regime in Afghanistan. I'll then address the specific US approach taken to remove the regime, along with the effectiveness of that approach. I'll also address why state building during an external invasion could either succeed or fail, highlighting some prior examples. I will then touch on the present state of affairs in Afghanistan and why the US is still involved in that state. I'll finally recap with lessons to be learnt from the external regime change. The US decision to invade Afghanistan in an attempt to change its regime was a direct response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks against the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington back in September 2001. As a result of that terrorist attack, over 3,000 Americans lost their lives that day. This was seen as a direct threat against the US, and the first attack on their own soil in many decades. This was to be seen as a potential sign of weakness in the US's ability to defending its own state. As a result, there was dramatic changes made to the US foreign policy. President Bush declared directly a global war on terror, and the terror was identified as Al-Qaeda, a non-state actor, and the terrorist organisation potentially responsible for the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the US. Al-Qaeda was also known to be connected to the Taliban regime, which was the current regime at that point in Afghanistan. It was known to use Afghanistan as an operational base, of which their members were able to train in pursuit of potential future terrorist attacks. The US government requested the Taliban regime to hand over or to provide specific information that will lead to the convictions and the findings of Al-Qaeda members, in particular bin Laden. However, the Taliban refused to cooperate. It was at that time that the US decided that if they were to invade Afghanistan and remove the current Taliban regime and replace it with a more democratic regime, that they would be able to extinguish the threat of Al-Qaeda. So as you can see, this decision to invade Afghanistan was for ideological reasons, and the US was not specifically threatened by Afghanistan as a state itself. The US approach which is adopted to change the Afghanistan regime was heavily based on a direct military commitment to the state. It relied on a combination of air power, special forces, and the Northern Alliance to overturn the Taliban regime. Which it did. It only took a matter of weeks to months before the Taliban regime had left Afghanistan. What is important to note here is that the US sought to build a demographic regime through pure military occupation and reconstruction that could survive upon the withdrawal of the US support. The US never really intended to remain in Afghanistan for a long period of time after the Taliban regime had been overturned. And the Bush administration actually cited a previous occupation of Japan as evidence that it could actually export democracy by military force as a successful strategy. although as we'll see, it really does depend on the strength of the actual state to which you are trying to overtake or change the regime of that state. As I've mentioned, in the post-Taliban environment, the US did not want to create or did not want to be involved in creating a future government of Afghanistan. It was largely left up to the Afghans, and the US looked to the UN to play a real active role in this process. So essentially it thought it had been victorious in the sense that it was able to come in and remove the Taliban, though as we'll see that the Taliban was essentially just heavily moved into Pakistan. It was not completely overrun, and it still remained an active force, albeit not in Afghanistan. While the US was effective in removing the Taliban regime initially, early on in the invasion, it didn't really rule out the Taliban long term. The Taliban was able to move into Pakistan, was able to, to rebuild and reassess, and it was still able to move freely around back into Afghanistan, particular in the later stages when the civilians didn't really have another government or a government that they could confide in and rely on long term. In assessing the effectiveness of the US military intervention of the state building in Afghanistan, there was a useful article prepared by Jonathan Monton called Intervention in State Building, Comparative Lessons from Japan, Iraq and Afghanistan. In this article, he focuses on 3 relevant items that should be assessed in terms of identifying the effectiveness of regime change. That is, the scope of state institutions, the strength of the state institution, and the state's regime type, whether or not it's currently a democracy or not. In assessing the US's intervention of Afghanistan, this article concluded that while the US attempted to build on both the scope and the strength of the Afghan state, it only focused on minimal functions such as the state's ability to maintain order and the strength of Afghan institutions. And in doing so, it really failed to achieve either of those goals. In regards to the type of regime that Afghanistan was currently under, it was acknowledged as being a very weak state, a non-democratic state, and accordingly it was going to always be more difficult to influence a successful regime change and turn it into a democratic state, which is ultimately what the US and its allies were hoping to achieve. So as a result, the US failed to convert its military victory over the Taliban into an Afghan victory from a political sense. Was the military force sufficient to remove the Taliban regime? While the US was successful in initially overthrowing the Taliban regime in 2001, it wasn't a permanent overthrow. Furthermore, the US approach to state building in Afghanistan post the Taliban was really not sufficient. The US did not want to adopt a more traditional post-conflict role of state building. It was really keen to withdraw its troops out of Afghanistan as quickly as possible and wanted to leave the state building up to the local Afghan people and play a very minor role. It was concerned that the traditional approach of post-conflict state building would be in conflict with its ultimate goal of its war on terror regime. And it's important to note that at this stage, Afghanistan was a weakened state. Overthrowing the Taliban and attempting to replace the regime with a democratic government promptly failed to really acknowledge the complex background of the Afghan people. Furthermore, with the US's simplistic approach to how it would remove the current regime, it failed to recognise, however painful to accept, that the Taliban were still representative of some major sections of the Afghan society. And really, it tried to resolve one single political conflict from which Afghanistan had already been suffering for nearly a quarter of a century when the US and its allies came and invaded. So unwittingly, the US and allies was in fact taking sides in a civil war which was still unresolved and struggled between town and country. Furthermore, the government that was left to rebuild post the removal of the Taliban wasn't specifically united. That within the parliament that was built, there was people from many different backgrounds, both of religious views and also civil, and that just led to controversy over the years to come and conflict. And this unrest in the parliament really gave the warlords within Afghanistan legitimacy and more power. It could be said that the US was really more focused on announcing when the military would be removed from the state instead of assessing the underlying political conflicts at stake. And accordingly, the Taliban was able to rebuild in Pakistan and over time regain power again in Afghanistan. Okay, for the next couple of slides, I was going to focus on why state building during an external invasion will either fail or potentially succeed. In doing so, I've identified 4 dominant factors of why a success or a fail might occur on behalf of the external state. And the first factor I've identified is the level of commitment that's displayed by the external state. It's acknowledged that state building can be extremely expensive and requires a significant amount of time and commitment and a deep understanding of the other state that they're looking to evade for it to be successful. While it's acknowledged in the Afghan invasion by the US that the US has provided more than $54 billion US dollars of funding to train the Afghan military, it's acknowledged that the military and the police still rely on the US support for many combat tasks. So this really does bring into question, while the funding's been available, the strategy and the implementation of such a strategy you think has been lacklustre because they haven't been successful with its end game is to have a state that has a standalone military going forward. The second factor is prior conditions in the target state. And this is really around whether the targeted state for intervention has any prior experience with democratic governance or previous state institution capabilities. As we'd seen with the invasion that US took into Japan and Germany, it was acknowledged that both those states had a history of democratic governance, and therefore it was really that's really a good predictor of the future state strength is really based in the past. So I guess if we look at the Afghanistan perspective, questions could really be asked of how well the US understood the history of Afghanistan and whether or not it thought by invading its current regime that it was going to be successful in implementing or aiding a democratic governance going forward. This is also another criticism of the US invasion of Afghanistan, is that it really didn't acknowledge the barriers to building scope and strength of the state in question, that in the case of Afghanistan really lacked the capability and the high levels of economic development that was really going to be required if it was to be successful in establishing a new regime going forward. The next factor is around aid and incentives, and that in many of these invasions, the external state may provide, quite generous capacity or funding to the domestic state, and has a result that the national leaders may have little incentive to invest scarce resources that they have to improve their own state capacity, and instead they will continue to rely on international actors. I think that could be clearly said for the case in regards to the US invasion of Afghanistan, as we can already see with the funding of the military force, as noted on the previous slide. The final factor was in regards to agitational factors. In this respect, leaders of the external states will hold specific views about the role of the state in the context of their own domestic politics. It can be said that there could be two types of leaders: those that with a positive view of liberty and who view their role in building conditions necessary for democracy to advance. Alternatively, other leaders have a negative view and really want to put a constraint on the weak state in order for it to be able to prosper. And it was very specific, the announcement of the Bush administration and its strategy was never there to design to build a civilian society, and was never really there as a strategy to build Afghanistan and for it to grow going forward. This slide provides an insight into the present state of affairs in Afghanistan. The picture on the left-hand side really just depicts the current Afghanistan army, of which the military is entirely funded by the US, as previously noted. The picture on the left-hand side is a picture of the Taliban, obviously capturing Sergeant, and really indicates that since 2001 that it is actually still stronger than ever. So really the attempt to change the regime back in 2001 by the US has really failed. And the picture at the bottom is just a snapshot of the Afghan military, really indicating that it's still weak and it's still unable to act on its own, really because of inside corruption and the reliance on the US. The question as to why the US is still involved in Afghanistan has highlighted from the pictures of the previous slide. Despite US and Afghan military efforts, the Taliban still controls a vast majority of Afghan territory, and in fact more since the US invasion back in 2001. As a result, that acts as a significant terror threat to the US security. Furthermore, the Afghanistan military is thought to be weak, partially because of corruption in its own government and partially because of the continued reliance on the US. So as a result, as it stands now, that the military is unable to really defend itself against insurgents, including the Taliban and other terrorist organisations. In doing so, the US currently and still continues to pay 100% of the military costs associated with the Afghan army and security, and close to 90% of the entire budget for the Afghan state. That's a significant contribution, and if they were to pull out, there's questions about how the state would function going forward. It's still acknowledged as being an extremely weak state. It's also noted that second to Syria, Afghanistan is potentially in a future refugee crisis, and whether or not spending into Afghanistan could prevent such a crisis across Europe and other states going forward. And finally, has been stated by numerous commentators, that the United States is a very pride and prestigious country, and it continues to have involvement, has a matter of pride and prestige. And given that it commenced a job back in 2001, it's questionable whether or not it wants to remove itself until that job is done. I'll briefly recap on the lessons to be learnt from external regime change. It's pivotal that the military planning must be based on historical evidence and a strong understanding of the target state. It's arguable that in the case of the US invasion into Afghanistan, this was clearly not the case. Furthermore, the external actor needs to have a clear understanding of the political and economic landscape of the target state. once again, I believe this was a key factor that was missing in the US attempted regime change in Afghanistan. Furthermore, the external actor needs to be clear of their own national interests and how a regime change will achieve its own interests long term. I think for the US that its interests long term kept changing, and its wider goal was really an invasion into Iraq in 2003, and had little thought about the continued operations in Afghanistan. I also leave this presentation with questioning alternatives to military-only force. After the invasion into Afghanistan, it could be concluded that unless the external state is willing to participate in nation building, then they should question whether military force alone will ever be successful in overcoming a regime in a foreign country. And finally, I've left this question for the class, if there's time permitting. Do you think alternative measures to military force would have been effective in the case of the US invasion into Afghanistan? Why or why not? Okay, thank you. I hope you've enjoyed it.